Carl Jung said something about Jesus that makes both believers and atheists deeply uncomfortable. He argued that Jesus didn't come to offer escape from the human condition, didn't provide a way out of suffering, didn't promise that following him would make life easier or consciousness less painful. Instead, Jung believed Jesus represented something far more psychologically radical and far more difficult to accept: consciousness without escape, the demand that you face reality fully without the comfort of illusions, without the refuge of denial, without the hope that some external savior will rescue you from the burden of being aware. This contradicts almost everything popular Christianity teaches. The Church promises escape through salvation, relief from guilt through forgiveness, eventual freedom from suffering in heaven, the hope that Jesus will return and fix everything wrong with the world. It offers comfort, reassurance, the promise that if you believe correctly and behave morally, you'll be saved from the harsh realities of existence. But Jung saw in the actual life and teaching of Jesus something entirely different, something most people cannot and will not accept. He saw the representation of consciousness that has expanded to include all of reality, both light and darkness, both good and evil, both creation and destruction, and that cannot retreat back into unconsciousness or denial once it has seen clearly. Jesus in Gethsemane, knowing what's coming, asking if the cup can pass from him, discovering it cannot, and choosing to drink it anyway. Jesus on the cross, abandoned by God and man, experiencing the full weight of human suffering without escape, without rescue, without the consolation that it means something or leads somewhere better. Jesus descending into hell in the ancient creeds, going into the darkest places of consciousness where there is no light, no hope, no exit. This, Jung argued, is the actual teaching, that consciousness expanded to its fullest extent cannot escape from reality, cannot avoid suffering, cannot retreat into comforting illusions, but must face everything directly and still choose to remain conscious despite the unbearable weight of that awareness. The story that reveals this teaching most clearly is one that Christianity has tried to domesticate into theology about sacrifice and atonement, but Jung saw it as pure psychology about the moment when consciousness confronts its own inescapability. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane after the Last Supper, knowing that betrayal, torture, and death are imminent. The text says he was deeply distressed and troubled, that he told his disciples his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. This isn't serene acceptance of divine will. This is consciousness fully experiencing the horror of what's coming, feeling the natural human desire to escape, to avoid, to be anywhere but here facing this reality. And then comes the prayer that Christianity has interpreted theologically, but that Jung read psychologically. Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. This is the cry of consciousness that has seen clearly what reality demands and desperately wants an escape route, wants to not have to drink this particular cup, wants God or fate or the universe to provide some other path that doesn't require going through what's ahead. It's the prayer every person prays when consciousness expands enough to see clearly the suffering that cannot be avoided, the losses that must be endured, the darkness that must be entered. Take this cup from me. Let there be another way. Rescue me from what I can see coming. But the answer that comes back, both to Jesus and to anyone whose consciousness has expanded beyond comfortable illusions, is devastating. The cup cannot pass. There is no escape route. No divine intervention will prevent what you can see must happen. No rescue is coming. Consciousness, once expanded to see clearly, cannot retreat back into unconsciousness, cannot unsee what it has seen, cannot avoid what reality demands. And then comes the second half of the prayer, the part that represents consciousness without escape. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Jung interpreted this not as submission to external divine authority, but as the moment when consciousness accepts its own inescapability. When you stop fighting against what you can clearly see must be faced, when you choose to remain conscious and present even though every fiber of your being wants to escape. This is the psychological crisis that every person faces when consciousness expands beyond the ego's comfortable illusions. You see clearly that suffering cannot be avoided, that loss is built into existence, that the people you love will die or leave, that your body will fail and decay, that all your achievements will turn to dust, that consciousness itself leads inevitably toward confronting its own mortality. And the natural response is to want escape, to pray for the cup to pass, to hope that maybe you won't have to face what you can clearly see is coming. But consciousness expanded to full awareness cannot retreat. The cup will not pass. The only choice is whether you'll face it consciously, accepting the inescapability, or whether you'll spend your remaining time in denial, avoidance, and desperate seeking for escape routes that don't exist. Jung saw Jesus in Gethsemane as the archetypal image of this moment that every person must eventually face, the moment when consciousness confronts its own inescapability and must choose whether to remain present or fragment into desperate seeking for escape. The disciples sleeping while Jesus prayed represents the normal human response: unconsciousness, avoidance, the inability to stay awake to what consciousness reveals. But Jesus stays conscious, faces the inescapability, accepts that the cup will not pass, and chooses to drink it fully rather than fragment into denial or avoidance. 7:30. The cross as consciousness without rescue. If Gethsemane represents consciousness seeing its inescapability, the crucifixion represents consciousness experiencing that inescapability fully without rescue or relief. Jung analyzed the crucifixion not primarily as a theological event about sin and atonement, but as a psychological symbol of what happens when consciousness remains present through the full weight of suffering that cannot be escaped. Jesus on the cross experiences physical torture that he cannot avoid or minimize. He experiences betrayal by those he trusted, abandonment by those he loved, mockery by those he tried to serve. He experiences the collapse of his mission, the apparent failure of his teaching, the seeming meaninglessness of his sacrifice. And most devastatingly, he experiences what the Gospels record as the cry of dereliction: my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is consciousness at its most expanded and most unbearable, aware of abandonment not just by humans but by the divine itself, experiencing the void where God should be, finding nothing but absence where meaning and purpose should provide consolation. Traditional theology tries to explain this away, saying Jesus was quoting Psalm 22 or that this was part of the divine plan. But Jung read it as psychological truth. Consciousness expanded to its fullest extent eventually confronts the absence of external rescue, the silence of God, the void where consoling meaning should be but isn't. This is the moment every person's consciousness eventually reaches if it expands far enough. The recognition that no external savior is coming, that you must face reality alone, that consciousness itself provides no escape from the burden of awareness. And the crucial detail that Jung emphasized: Jesus doesn't escape. There's no supernatural intervention, no angels arriving to rescue him, no divine power manifested to avoid the suffering. He stays on the cross, fully conscious, experiencing the complete weight of human suffering and divine absence without escape, without rescue, without the comfort of meaning or purpose. He drinks the cup to its dregs. This is consciousness without escape, remaining present through suffering that cannot be avoided, staying aware through experiences that every instinct wants to flee from, accepting that no rescue is coming and still choosing to remain conscious rather than fragmenting into denial or checking out into unconsciousness. Jung recognized that this is what genuine transformation requires: not escape from suffering but full consciousness through it, not rescue from the human condition but acceptance of its inescapability, not finding meaning that makes it bearable but remaining present even when meaning itself has collapsed. The crucifixion isn't offering you a way out. It's showing you what consciousness without escape looks like, what it means to stay present through the unbearable, what it costs to expand awareness to include all of reality without the comfort of illusions. Jung understood why Christianity couldn't maintain this teaching in its raw form. Consciousness without escape is unbearable for most people. The demand that you remain fully present through suffering without hope of rescue, that you expand awareness to include all of reality's darkness without the comfort of eventual relief, that you accept the inescapability of consciousness once expanded, this is too much for the ordinary ego to tolerate. So Christianity created escape routes, theological mechanisms that preserve the symbols while completely inverting their meaning. The crucifixion becomes a sacrifice that saves you from having to face what Jesus faced, rather than a demonstration of what consciousness requires. The resurrection becomes proof that suffering isn't final, that rescue does come, that if you believe correctly, you'll escape what Jesus couldn't escape. Heaven becomes the ultimate escape route, the promise that eventually you won't have to be conscious of suffering anymore, that reality's unbearable aspects are only temporary. Prayer becomes a way to petition for escape rather than a practice of accepting inescapability. Faith becomes believing that God will rescue you rather than trusting that consciousness can remain present even without rescue. All of these theological developments serve one purpose: to provide escape from the teaching that Jesus actually demonstrated, to offer comfort where Jesus offered consciousness, to promise rescue where Jesus showed inescapability. Jung saw this as inevitable but tragic. Inevitable because most people cannot tolerate consciousness without escape, cannot accept that expanding awareness means facing reality fully without the comfort of illusions. Tragic because the actual transformative power of the teaching gets lost, replaced by religion that reinforces the ego's need for escape while using the language of transformation. The Jesus who stays on the cross conscious through abandonment becomes the Jesus who rescues you from having to be conscious. The teaching about facing reality fully becomes a promise that you won't have to face it. The demonstration of consciousness without escape becomes a guarantee of eventual escape if you believe correctly. This inversion explains why Christianity, despite claiming to follow Jesus, creates so much of the avoidance, denial, and desperate seeking for escape that Jesus' life directly challenged. The religion built around him does the opposite of what he demonstrated, offering escape where he showed inescapability, promising rescue where he stayed present without rescue, providing theological consolation where he experienced divine absence. So what does it mean practically to live with consciousness without escape, to take seriously what Jung saw Jesus demonstrating rather than what Christianity promises? It means first recognizing and accepting that suffering cannot be avoided, that consciousness itself guarantees you'll experience loss, disappointment, failure, the death of those you love, the decay of your own body, the collapse of your cherished beliefs, the failure of your projects. You cannot escape this through positive thinking, through sufficient faith, through correct beliefs, through any spiritual practice or psychological technique. Consciousness expanded to see reality clearly must see this clearly. It means second, that no external rescue is coming, that praying for the cup to pass won't make it pass, that God or the universe or fate isn't going to intervene to save you from what consciousness reveals must be faced. You're not being punished by divine absence. You're discovering what consciousness without comforting illusions actually experiences. The silence isn't cruelty, it's reality. It means third, that staying conscious through what cannot be escaped is the work itself, not a preliminary stage before rescue arrives. The crucifixion isn't followed by resurrection as an escape from death. It's followed by resurrection as a symbol of consciousness that has gone through death fully and discovered something on the other side, not as escape from the human condition, but as transformation through accepting its inescapability. And it means finally that this consciousness without escape isn't pessimism or despair, though it moves through both. It's the discovery that consciousness can remain present through what seems unbearable, that awareness doesn't fragment when rescue doesn't come, that you're capable of facing reality fully even when every comforting illusion has been stripped away. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you wished you were, and it requires precisely this consciousness without escape, this willingness to see clearly and remain present even when what you see is unbearable and no rescue is coming. Jung spent his later years trying to help people understand what Jesus actually demonstrated versus what Christianity promises. He knew it was difficult teaching because the ego wants escape, wants rescue, wants to believe that consciousness can expand without the burden of facing reality fully. But he also knew it was true in the deepest psychological sense, verified not through faith, but through the lived experience of anyone whose consciousness has expanded far enough to confront its own inescapability. Jesus in Gethsemane and on the cross isn't offering you a way out. He's showing you what consciousness looks like when it stays present through what cannot be escaped, when it remains aware despite divine absence, when it accepts that the cup will not pass and chooses to drink it fully rather than fragmenting into denial or avoidance. This is uncomfortable, threatening, completely contrary to what religion promises. But it's also liberation in the deepest sense. Freedom not from the human condition, but from the exhausting effort to escape it. Peace not through rescue, but through acceptance of inescapability. Transformation not by becoming someone who doesn't suffer, but by being conscious through suffering without needing it to mean something or lead somewhere better. If this exploration of Jung's most difficult teaching has touched something in you, if you recognize the futility of seeking escape from what consciousness reveals, if you're ready to understand what it means to remain present without rescue, then subscribe to this channel. Because we're continuing to examine these uncomfortable truths that strip away consoling illusions, that challenge the ego's demand for escape, that point toward the transformation that comes through accepting consciousness in its full, inescapable weight. The cup will not pass. The question isn't whether you'll have to drink it. The question is whether you'll remain conscious while doing so, or spend your life in desperate avoidance of what you can already clearly see must be faced.